Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation here on the Tattooed Historians YouTube channel. My name's John. I am the Tattooed Historian, and it's great to be joined by my Rustly friend, Jonathan S. Jones. he's getting fixed in the chair there, and it's good to see you, my friend. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Thanks. Good to be with you again.
Yes, absolutely. It's always good to be with you. For those of you who haven't seen Jonathan on previous live events we've had here, he's been on a couple times. Jonathan is an assistant professor of history at James Madison University and the author of what we're going to discuss tonight, Opium Slavery, Civil War Veterans, and America's First Opioid Crisis, published by our friends at UNC Press. It's a groundbreaking study that reveals how the war ignited a nationwide epidemic of addiction among its survivors. His work uncovers the lived experiences of veterans and their families, the medical profession's early attempts to confront addiction, and the ripple effects that reshaped American society in unexpected ways. A link to that book for anyone who wants to pick it up, which I want you to pick it up. I hope you pick it up. A link to it is in the live chat. Beyond the archives, Jonathan's a valuable public scholar whose insights have appeared in the Washington Post, Vice, Slate, NPR, the BBC, and more. And again, Jonathan, it is great to see you back here. Last time we were talking about gaming, and now we're talking about drugs and addiction.
That's right. Yeah, both kind of off the wall topics when we think about like what Civil War history is. And I think that's kind of the common thread for me.
Yeah, yeah. When did you first get interested in this era in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was actually trying to remember. I think that this project started for me around the year 2013, so it's been back since the Stone Age. But I first when I was a master's student, I kept kind of finding in primary sources like random references to Civil War veterans who were described as morphine eaters and having morphiomania, things like that, like sort of really sort of off the wall descriptions for drug use. And I couldn't get that out of my brain. I took some time away from grad school and then came back to it. And I knew that this was a topic, it was kind of still lodged in my head. So I knew I had to go back to this topic. And also I was watching constant coverage of the opioid crisis, which was going on then, still going on now. And so I think putting the two together highly motivated me to kind of dig further into this topic. I'll also say that I was shocked and am still kind of surprised to find that no one had really written much about Civil War veterans and drugs before, or the Civil War and drugs kind of as a whole. And so that is always like a gold mine. Like when you're a historian, you can find something no one's worked on before. You're like obligated to to uncover as much as you can. So
I read through it, obviously, and made notations all through it and underlined things and everything. And it really made me think about how human these people are. Sometimes we put them on a pedestal and we think of them as larger than life, and they went through so much, and then they went home and went on with life. But that's not the human condition all the time. There's going to be effects. And I thought of that over and over again while I was reading through this and thinking of friends of mine who have served and what they've had to deal with. How important was it for you to get this out in a timely manner, to be able to make those parallel connections with veterans who we see today?
I think it was a lot of incentive. I knew that the book, I wanted to speak, as a historian to current events as well, not just the past. And so for me, there was a kind of time incentive. I also hope, and maybe this is a little bit naive, but I hope that the book will help someone like today, like that the book could help inform kind of policy debates about veterans healthcare, about healthcare as a whole, but especially about healthcare for drug users. And so what I wanted to do was show sort of the 19th century version of debates that we still have today, 150 years later. And so for me, a kind of a time sensitive topic, not just uncovering and publishing historical research, but doing so not too fast, but in a timely way to help try to inform some of those debates is what I was aiming for.
For everyone who's joining us, thank you again for being here. I asked Jonathan to provide a slideshow for us to get us started and get the juices flowing to think of questions and comments and concerns about this topic and maybe those rhymes of history as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan to be able to give that slide presentation, and then I will keep track of everyone's questions and comments as they come into the live chat and keep those for the end after he finishes up. So Jonathan, I'll turn it over to you.
For sure. Sounds great. So I will, one of the cool things about being a historian, after you publish a book, you get to talk about the book, and you can include things that didn't make it into the book. So you can kind of raid the cutting room floor. And that's what I've done tonight. I've tried to pull out some images that I think really illustrate the history that I write about in my new book, the history of what amounted to America's first and earliest opioid crisis in the decades after the Civil War, after the 1860s. And so I pulled out a bunch of images that I want to use as kind of conversation starters, and I'll tell a narrative version of the story using these images. But of course, I'm most excited for question and answer. So happy to answer any questions that you have or that you want to discuss further after I talk for about 15 minutes or 20 minutes. First of all, here's the book cover. The first thing that people see when they look at the book is this amazing cover that was produced by the designers at UNC Press. And this image was actually the very last image that I came by in my research. This is what was called a cabinet card. The image kind of that's tinted in blue is actually sort of like a 3-inch by 4-inch sort of a medical advertisement by the doctor who's seen here holding a needle and posing with someone who's supposed to be a patient as if he has just been injected or is about to be injected with morphine. And what I love about this image, besides the fact that it's meant to show the central act of the book, which is using drugs, I love the fact that this image is totally staged. Really, this image is just an idea of what 19th century Americans thought drug users looked like and what they went through when they would inject substances like morphine. And so I think that's a nice segue into the story that I tell in the book. It's both an epidemiological story. It's telling how so many Civil War veterans got addicted to opiates, what their lives looked like medically, but it's also a cultural history of the phenomenon of drug use. It asks questions like, what did it mean for a man to use drugs in the 19th century? What were some of the kind of cultural baggages that went along with that? And how did that inform how we think about drugs in modern America? So this image kind of gets at both of those histories that I tell in the book. A little bit of backstory, though, I think is really helpful. Opium itself is one of mankind's oldest drugs. There's evidence that dates opium use back to the Stone Age in Neolithic Europe, when archaeologists have found traces of cultivated opium poppies in basically what amounted to like Neolithic trash heaps. And so I love that it's a book about trash heaps, is sometimes the way I think about it. But what you're looking at here on the left-hand side of the screen is an opium poppy. Opioids originally were produced from opium poppies. These can be grown all over the world. In the 19th century, they were grown in India and Turkey. Today, most opium comes from Afghanistan, sort of similar climates, really good for opium cultivation. People throughout kind of the ancient world, Greece and Rome, into medieval Europe, really valued opium as a substance that could produce a sense of euphoria despite pain. And so it was immediately known to be a painkiller. That's how it was used for hundreds, even thousands of years. By the time that the 1800s rolls around, the century that the US Civil War occurs in the 1860s, in the United States, opium was also prized for many different preparations. You can make things out of the opium plant besides just opium itself. And so Americans in the 19th century used opium. They would take the seeds and the plant, and especially the juices of the plant that emerge during the cultivation process. They would dry it. Sometimes they would take those little pieces of opium orally. They would swallow it. It's known as gum opium. But more increasingly common as the century kind of got closer and closer to the year 1860 and then the decades after that, more common was preparing opium into a more potent version of opium called morphine. And that's a bottle of morphine we see here on the right-hand side. Both of these kinds of opium-based drugs or opioids were widely available throughout the 19th century, especially during and after the Civil War. During the Civil War, physicians who in kind of army speak are all called surgeons. Army surgeons really prized these medications because of their utility during and after battle. Opium obviously is a really powerful painkiller. Morphine is about 10 times as powerful as opium, if we sort of weigh them against each other. And so immediately there was recognition, both in the Union and the Confederacy, that the war was going to bring about the need or the demand for these drugs in mind-boggling quantities. And so immediately kind of both governments sort of went into opium cultivation mode, opium purchasing mode. They also came up with lots of innovative ways of procuring opium. The federal government, or the US government, for the first time ever during the Civil War, needs so much opium and other kinds of drugs that it actually creates the first industrialized pharmacies. These were government-funded pharmaceutical laboratories in Philadelphia and Long Island, New York, that churned out opium and quinine and morphine by the millions of ounces. And so I think that the Civil War, as a kind of industrializing process for the trade in drug and substances, is really fascinating. The Confederacy, for their part, really struggled to procure all kinds of medicines, including opium. And so one of the best ways that the Confederacy had, under the threat of a Union blockade, to actually acquire medicines like opium was to steal them from the Union. And so kind of constant raiding to procure opium and take it back away into the Confederacy. People also came up with really ingenious ways to smuggle opium into the Confederacy. There is a museum in Richmond called the American Civil War Museum that has a little girl's porcelain doll from the 1860s that was used to smuggle medicine into the Confederacy inside of the doll's head. So I love that kind of sort of ingenuity. I think is really fascinating to study as a historian. I would also add that the Confederacy tried to rely on enslaved people to grow opium, but the cultivation of cotton and the price put on the heads of enslaved people during the war was so high that it wasn't really, there wasn't much incentive for Confederate planters to go about cultivating opium that way. And so the Confederacy really did struggle to procure these drugs. Now, what's that got to do with this dude here on the screen? This is one of my very favorite Civil War photos. This is an individual known as an apothecary. And so in the Union Army, surgeons write the prescriptions. Apothecaries actually make the prescription and give it over to the patient. And so the apothecary was this guy was a really important character in Civil War hospitals, and he knew it. And so what he's doing for us here is posing with his main contribution to the war effort. He's holding a mortar and pestle. He's standing by bottles. We could, say maybe these are medicine bottles, although it's unclear what kinds of medicines are in there. Either way, he's saying opium medicines, me, the medicine dispenser, we're all important to the Union cause. The Confederates had their own way of kind of stressing the centrality of opiates to the war. A Confederate medical handbook published during the Civil War called opium as important to the surgeon as gunpowder to the ordnance. And so again, really important medications, and we can see that visually and through other kinds of sources as well. One of the kind of annoying things about being a historian is that it's difficult to sometimes get at phenomenon that are so common, but they're often not written down, sometimes because they're too commonplace. And so medical procedures can be like that from time to time. People are giving out medicines, they're not always writing down what they're doing. I was really lucky during my research process to stumble into sources from Union and Confederate hospitals where people were writing down how much opium they were dispensing. And so I was able to come up with a really good picture of how off the charts opiate use became during the Civil War. Opium kind of ultimately ended up being, it depends on how you count it, but really the third most commonly prescribed medication during the Civil War, second only to food and quinine. And so what you're looking at here, if you look really closely at the screen, you can see some red underlines. Each block of script or text here represents a prescription that a surgeon has ordered an apothecary to make for a patient in a hospital, a Union or Confederate soldier. And in red, I've underlined where opium or another opiate is listed as an ingredient in these prescriptions. And so what we're looking at here basically is a page full of prescriptions, and 4 or 5 out of 6 of these prescriptions contain opiates. That gives us a sense just of how commonplace these medications were. When we think about the Civil War, one of the things that kind of immediately leaps into our minds is this idea of catastrophic wounds. And it's true, the Civil War did involve really novel, really painful forms of injuries that had not been widely seen in American medicine. American soldiers had never faced these kinds of injuries before. Amputations are very, very common during the Civil War. All sorts of surgeries are kind of pioneered during the Civil War to retrieve bullets and set bones, and all of these procedures are absurdly painful. And so that only heightened the importance of drugs like opium and other kind of related painkillers like chloroform, things like that, to the nth degree. These were really, really, really important medicines. And oftentimes, because Civil War veterans had these permanent disfiguring injuries like amputations, they would require lifelong pain relief. And so in the case of this particular guy, George Lemon, a Union Army soldier who suffered an amputation during the war, there was a follow-up study done where he reported to his surgeons after the war that he was in a tremendous amount of pain, so much pain that he couldn't even use a prosthetic leg. And so it's easy to imagine why Civil War veterans who have undergone these procedures are needing a lot of painkillers for a long period of time. Those are the kinds of patterns that are conducive with an addictive drug like opium to developing substance use, what we would call today a substance use disorder, a dependency on opium. That's to be expected when we think about sort of the images that we're familiar with coming out of Civil War medicine and also out of kind of pop culture depictions of the Civil War. They're always really gruesome. What Hollywood leaves out of Civil War hospitals and Civil War medicines, kind of the depiction of the Civil War generally, is the presence of diarrhea. This is super gross, but the number one medical complaint that Civil War soldiers had was diarrhea. Statistically, almost every single Union Army soldier was struck by diarrhea bad enough at some point during the Civil War to need hospitalization. Now imagine how bad your diarrhea has to be to actually go to the hospital. Why? Why is this such a big phenomenon during the Civil War, and what's it got to do with opium? The Civil War occurs in an era where there's a very limited knowledge of microbes. So what that meant for soldiers, they didn't know that they needed to wash their hands to kill germs because they can't see the germs. They're not familiar with the germ theory of disease yet at this time. And so not as much attention as we would pay today into camp sanitation. Oftentimes, another kind of fun fact that I discovered when researching opiates in the Civil War, soldiers were usually responsible for cooking their own food for the first time in their lives. They had always relied on their mothers, their sisters. Cooking was seen in this era as being woman's work. And so men have to cook for themselves for the first time. They have no idea what they're doing. They're creating undercooked food a lot of the time. And so without knowledge of germs, that also meant no antibiotics. And so when a Civil War soldier picked up a bacterial infection from a camp or from a prison camp or just wherever, from walking around in the mud after an army of horses have passed by, there's a million ways to get sick in the Civil War. Sometimes those infections never went away. They became what Civil War soldiers and doctors called chronic diarrhea, which means a very long-term case of diarrhea. Now, again, what's this got to do with opium? The number one anti-diarrheal drug in the 1800s is opium. Opium not only relieves pain, but it also causes constipation. And so, in other words, opium was a life-saving drug because it could sort of counteract the effects of potentially lethal dehydrating diarrhea. Yet another way that people consumed and also got addicted to opium during the Civil War. Now, after the Civil War, the problem did not go away. Really, it only got worse. As individuals returned home from the war, the lucky survivors, they oftentimes carried their grievous medical injuries, their sicknesses home with them. And so that led to sort of an elevated demand all over the country, not just in Civil War hospitals, for opium. Where I live in Virginia, I live in a part of the former Confederacy that was really devastated by years of armies kind of moving back and forth over the same terrain. Multiple harvests were interrupted. Lots of sick and injured people. Also, the enlistment rate in the Confederate Army in the Shenandoah Valley was very, very high. And so these are the kinds of conditions that are conducive to things like poverty, things like a lot of sort of mental trauma, and also things that we kind of commonly today associate with areas where opioid use is very elevated. And so that was the case after the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley and in other parts of the South. For example, in 1879, so this is about 15 years after the end of the Civil War, 14 years, the New York Times got wind of the fact that in pharmacies in Stanton, Virginia, one of the main kind of towns in the Shenandoah Valley, that the pharmacists in the town were prescribing and dispensing, opium off the charts. And so a reporter goes to Stanton, kind of goes through the books of different pharmacies and learns that they, in one calendar year, have given more than 79,000 doses of opioids to pharmacy customers. And that's just what they wrote down. The phenomenon of opiate buying and selling and consumption in Stanton and in the Shenandoah Valley was so high that the New York Times called it an epidemic. So when we're historians, when we're studying phenomenons that we would consider an epidemic, it's also important to recognize whether or not people in the past considered that phenomenon to be an epidemic. And so, yes, during the Civil War era, there was a recognition that these substances were addictive and that they had kind of a problem on their hands after the Civil War. So now every time I drive through Stanton on my way to work out in another town called Harrisonburg, I think, I'm passing through the Great Opium City, which is what the New York Times also called Stanton, Virginia. So a little tidbit there. For a variety of reasons, opiate addiction really devastated Civil War veterans' lives. I think some of the physical aspects of addiction, were really, really prominent and really hard on Civil War veterans. In my book, I studied the cases of 200 individual Civil War veterans. I tried to track them over the course of multiple decades, a kind of longitudinal study to figure out what it was like for them to live with addiction after surviving the nation's most catastrophic war. And what I found is that a lot of veterans lost a huge amount of weight. Some of the men in my study sample lost upwards of 50, 60 pounds during the course of their addictions, which could last for decades. And so that is, on the one hand, a medical phenomenon, like weight loss. Such extreme weight loss is elevated with the higher risk of death, is associated with the higher risk of death. But also in the Victorian era, this is the period when a lot of a man's identity as a man was tied to his body image. Surprisingly so, I think when we think about the past, we don't usually think about body image. But in the Civil War era, men were supposed to look like the guy on the left. They were supposed to be these sort of big, barrel-chested, kind of Teddy Roosevelt-looking characters. The reality, however, is that morphine use for decades and decades and decades left many Civil War veterans looking more like the fellow on the right, who is not actually a Civil War veteran, but this is a good kind of photograph for illustrative purposes. And so kind of the medical phenomenon of addiction was hard for a lot of veterans, but I think even harder were some of the cultural stigmas attached to addiction, like the idea that it made you less manly. Another important thing, I guess, that I want to mention, and this is where I get the title of the book from, a lot of veterans felt like they were humiliated by their dependence on opium, but they lacked a medicalized vocabulary to describe addiction. For example, the word addiction is much more common today. It existed back then, but it wasn't in common use. And so veterans really struggled to find words to describe what they were going through. A lot of them ended up settling on the slavery metaphor. Slavery is what's familiar to them. That's what the Civil War is about. Also, the metaphor of being enslaved to something was very common in 19th century speak. And so when one was addicted to opium, one was a quote, opium slave, and that carried different layers of meaning. Different sort of stigmatizing layers. Again, back to the kind of physical elements of addiction. When opium users, they tried to keep it a secret, most of the men that I studied, but oftentimes they were sort of unmasked. They were revealed by doctors or by family members or kind of government agents to be opium users. And one of the kind of most horrifying facets of that for observers, so not for veterans themselves, but other people looking at them, was the idea that veterans were causing themselves immense harm and they didn't seem inclined to quit. Now, of course, the reality is that veterans were addicted. They did try to quit over and over. Many of them relapsed. And so oftentimes veterans who used needles, again, kind of thinking back to the idea that they're not really familiar with pathogens, with germs and microbes, they didn't commonly clean their needles. They would oftentimes get these horrible abscesses and also kind of big injection scars. So kind of putting those two beliefs together, when outsiders looked at Civil War veterans, they saw men who not only looked unmanly because of their weight, because of their health, but also men who were covered with the apparent signs of self-abuse. At least that's how it was perceived in 19th century society. So for a variety of reasons, Civil War veterans who used drugs were kind of set apart from other veterans and sort of looked down on. The rubber, where the rubber meets the road, where this added up to sort of a crisis point for Civil War veterans, oftentimes had to do with money. Opiates were, relatively inexpensive, but they could get in the way of your ability to get income and to get pensions. About a month's supply of opium could cost anywhere, depending on kind of the year and the place, anywhere upwards of $10 a month. And so oftentimes Civil War veterans who used opium were already disabled through a physical wound. They weren't as able to take care of themselves, their families financially in a manual labor-based economy. When you add the cost of needing to buy a month's worth of morphine, once a month, the cost really added up quickly. And so addicted veterans, also other veterans generally speaking, were highly incentivized to go out and procure pensions. A pension is a periodic check that the federal government and individual Confederates, former Confederate state governments would write and give out to Civil War veterans and their widows. If one was found out to be an opium user, that meant that you were going to get denied a pension. And so again, the cost of opium addiction, the stigma of opium addiction really added up in a variety of ways to a kind of crisis, a burden for Civil War veterans. Now, this image does appear in the book. You might think that a picture of a bunch of handwriting would be way too boring to put into a book. But what I see when I look at this image is actually this kind of sticky note on the top. This is the Gilded Age version of a sticky note. So it's actually glued to a page in this Union veteran's pension application. He's describing why he deserves a pension. And so someone processing this form at the federal government pension bureau in Washington, D.C. was so kind of like disgusted with this particular person because it came out during the pension application process he was an opium user, that they actually put this sticky note on the surface of his pension application saying that this claimant is a morphine eater. And I can only assume that's in case he reapplied, they see the sticky note, denied, right? That's kind of how the pension process worked. Our ability to kind of deal with and treat and sort of kind of live with addiction today is much, I think, improved from how it was in the 19th century. There's an awareness of addiction, but there's a limited means to actually help addicted people either live with their addictions or quit using opium if that's what they want. And so kind of as a fallback, a lot of Civil War veterans ended up in jails, in kind of carceral apparatuses, and that included mental asylums. In the late 19th century, people who were deemed insane oftentimes were locked up for life in what back then were called, quote, lunatic asylums. And so Stanton, Virginia also, like many other towns, has one of these asylums. I went through the records and I'd love to answer any questions about this. These records are very difficult to actually access. But I was able to get a hold of a set of the patient records of this asylum, and I found dozens of Confederate veterans who were stuck in these facilities because of their addictions for life, even if they were ostensibly cured of their addiction, and I put cure in kind of air quotes. They were held there forever because they were seen as a threat to society. Their addiction might spread to someone else. That's kind of the 19th century way of thinking about it. However, there were so many people who used drugs after the Civil War, both veterans and also non-veterans alike, that there was a really big demand for addiction remedies, addiction treatment plans. And so after the Civil War, there was a wave of kind of creating, experimenting with different ways of treating addiction, besides just locking people into mental asylums. So you start to see the emergence of the early versions of modern day rehabs. One of those, for example, was called the Pinnell Hospital. It was located in the former Confederate capital. Here's a picture of it on the right that did not end up making it into the book. But as we can see in this classified advertisement on the left, this is a facility that was dedicated for, quote, the reclamation of opium users. Opium eaters is another kind of 19th century way of saying drug user. The idea is that this would be a more humane way to help and also to control opium users. They could be sent to Pinnell at the hospital. They would be kept until their dose was sort of lowered and lowered and lowered until ideally it got down to them taking 0 opium every day. Then they would be released. And so that sort of tapering down method is not too dissimilar to some of the approaches that are used to treat drug addiction today. Of course, today we also have medication-assisted therapy, which is a much more humane way and a much more effective way, honestly, to help someone who's struggling with substance use. That's not available to Americans in the 1800s, but this method, the other half of the equation, the kind of tapering down method, is invented in part to help deal with the fallout of the Civil War's addiction crisis. I will say, and this is kind of where I'll wrap up and then pivot over to any kind of questions, there was a mass market, a huge amount of demand for people who could purport to cure addiction. And so this being the Gilded Age, the post-Civil War decades, there were also not a lot of laws that restrained commercial activity. Kind of famously, this is sort of like a kind of bonanza period where if you could develop a product, there are no kind of customer or consumer safety laws. There's also very little drug regulation or medical regulation. So you could say, hey, I've got a cure for opium addiction. You could slap an ad in a newspaper and suddenly you've made a fortune. So one of the things that I do in the book and one of the things that I'm continuing to do in my research is to track how much money people made off of selling basically bogus opium addiction cures. We see here in this ad a couple of different examples of that. Opium habit cured, opium cured, opium morphine habit cured, these 3 ads here. People would see these ads in the paper. They would send a check to whoever it was that was selling the medication. If they were lucky, their check would be answered. They would get a vial of a mystery opium cure. 9 times out of 10, these they were called patent medicines. They had opium in them. And so they were not effective ways to treat addiction, but people put a lot of stock in them. I think that speaks to how desperate a lot of Civil War veterans were, but also the opportunity, the kind of really unscrupulous commercial opportunities that occur in the middle of an epidemic. We've seen a lot of that in today's opioid crisis as well. And so thanks for kind of going down my image tour. Most of these images did not actually make it into the book. And so it's a real treat for me to be able to get to kind of geek out about them.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I greatly appreciate all of the images that you put up today. This particular one is interesting to me because what you just said reminds me of people who saw vaping as a way to get off of tobacco use, and we found out that there was just nicotine involved in that route as well. It seems like there's an echo or a rhyme with this kind of thing where we find something that we think cures us of it, but in fact it has minuscule amounts of the thing we're trying to get off of within it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's definitely, I feel like historians debate this, but I feel like we're living in a Gilded Age 2.0, where a lot of these same phenomenons that occurred in the 1870s and 80s and 90s are occurring again today. And that kind of addiction cycle, like the need for addiction cures and then kind of fake addiction cures, or at least, cures that people put stock in that are later revealed to be kind of fraudulent. Is certainly a thing now and back then. I'd like to think that a century and a half has passed since the Civil War. Things would have improved, but not as much as we might expect, right?
Right. So I believe tonight YouTube is having an issue with the chat.
Okay, no worries.
I appreciate everyone who's tuning in right now. We still have 17 of you in the room, so please bear with that fact. I've put things in the chat throughout Jonathan's presentation just to test, and it keeps disappearing. So I think tonight YouTube is not playing nice with us. So I apologize to anyone who has questions. Maybe you could put it into the video when it's up, with the video on demand, and then we'll see if I can send it to Jonathan, and maybe he can give you some answers at a later point. But I do have a question about families and emotional labor. That seems to be an issue that a lot of people have overlooked as well, and that you touch upon. I'd love for you to discuss that just a little bit more, about the emotional strain or toll that this is placed on families even decades after the war.
Yeah, this is one of those kind of traces of the Civil War suffering that never really goes away. It lasts for decades and decades after 1865, the year the war is over. People think, oh, the war's over, we're going to return back home, we're going to rebuild, and kind of we can move on from there. Addiction made that impossible, basically. A lot of the reason for that is the stigma that gets put onto opium users. But with that stigma came a tremendous amount, like you're saying, John, of emotional labor for caretakers. Keep in mind also that a lot of Civil War veterans had kind of multiple forms of disability that made it very difficult for them to sort of physically take care of themselves, economically take care of themselves. And so historians have widely recognized that the Civil War caused a kind of inversion of the roles of men and women in the United States for several years, even decades after the Civil War. Men became dependent on women, which was the kind of a reversal of sort of the way that 19th century Americans expected things to be. Or at least 19th century men. And so that also added to this emotional labor, the fact that people couldn't live up to the kind of sort of idealized gender roles of the day, men as the breadwinners, women as the homemakers. Addiction made that very difficult. That only made the crisis even worse. But a little bit more about kind of the day-to-day lives of these families. Opium users got really fatigued a lot of the time. They suffered from gastrointestinal distress, not to mention the other forms of disability that came separately from their Civil War service. And so they really, a lot of them depended heavily on their families just to get by every day, to walk around, to feed themselves, to clothe themselves. And so it was a very different kind of post-war experience than a lot of people had bargained for, basically. I found one of the things that I think really kind of stuck with me the most after researching this book. When you're writing a book, you look at tens of thousands of pages of primary sources, right? Or, research material. And one of those pages really blew my mind and stuck with me because it was so sad. It was the letter of a Civil War veteran who was writing to one of those patent medicine sellers, asking for like free samples, basically, because he couldn't afford them. And he was like, I can't afford, this medicine that I need to cure myself of addiction, let alone, shoes to put on my daughter's feet or food to put in my son's mouth. And for me, that really resonated. I think that's, unfortunately, that's kind of a timeless experience when we think about these kind of recurring opioid crises that the United States goes through. Happened back in the Civil War, also happens, unfortunately, a lot today. But yeah, that's kind of lodged in my brain.
Yeah, that's such a timeless thing, sadly, in society, and something to think about when we're reading through this is that, again, these are human beings. They're right. Not the statues that we see on a battlefield. These are people who had hopes, dreams, and they could have been dashed by an addiction through all of this. The other thing that I thought was interesting was when I first got the book and I started reading through it, I was like, oh, this is going to be about people who had gunshot wounds or who had lost a limb, and they're using this as a painkiller. What's really interesting to me was it seemed like it didn't matter what they went through in the war itself. It could be as I don't want to make it sound like a minor issue, but it could have been dysentery, and they could have had this opium, and then they just became addicted to it. It seems like it was a wonder drug for so many people that they were just like, here, take this. This will cure this. This will cure X, Y, Z. And it really opened my eyes to the fact that you didn't even have to be in battle to get addicted to a painkiller.
Yeah, amazingly, most Civil War deaths didn't even come from battles, right? And so the kind of number one killer during the Civil War is actually disease. We're thinking about like epidemic diseases like smallpox, but also just like ordinary kind of things like ordinary for back then, right? Like dysentery and chronic diarrhea. These are prolific killers during the Civil War, and so I think that kind of underscores what you just said. You didn't actually need to be like injured or shot in combat to run the risk of becoming addicted through Civil War healthcare. Anything and everything can get you into that kind of a situation. One of the things, one of the kind of challenges that I faced when I was researching this project is that historians had very limited knowledge about how opiates were actually used back then. Like we knew, opiates are everywhere, people use them for everything, but how many things, which things? And so I actually had to sit down with a bunch of medical textbooks and hospital records and pharmacy records and like literally count out the number of different ailments or diseases that opium was prescribed for in the 1800s. The 1800s, and I stopped at 150 because I just couldn't keep counting, right? Like for loads of different things, including kind of the different painful conditions that we would think about, but also things like when a baby couldn't sleep, doctors advised that the mom give it opium. When a man had insomnia, he should take opium, like all different sorts of things. And so keep in mind also that Civil War era doctors, at least, were well aware that these were addictive substances. This was a live conversation about the risk of poisoning and addiction for decades before the Civil War. This was relatively common medical knowledge if you had been to medical school or if you had been maybe a medical apprentice. Some consumers also knew that these drugs were addictive. Even still, the Civil War's health crisis is so off the charts that people take opium, right? They need opium just to survive the war, and you can worry about the consequences after the war if you're lucky enough to make it that far.
It's incredible also that there's this stigma that's placed upon immigrants who are using opium, maybe even if I don't want to say responsibly, but in lesser doses than some of these veterans, and yet they are being described as the problem. They're the ones who are causing the issue. It's not the veterans who have an issue. And that's another echo that I saw in this book that I was like, oh, okay. So when someone who appears to be different or may not speak the language as well is using it, they're stigmatized, but the veteran is not stigmatized, or the mother or whoever else. It's such an interesting concept that again has that rhyme of history to it.
For sure, yeah. In the 19th century, this kind of, I guess what I will say is that the way that we think about addiction isn't just the product of medical knowledge. It's also the product of culture. The way that we think as a society, the way that we're kind of told to think and behave by cultural expectations really heavily informs how we think about addiction. And so kind of taking that idea and putting it back in the 1800s, this is a period where after the Civil War, we're seeing large scale immigration. And so a lot of immigrants, particularly Chinese immigrants arriving on the West Coast, arrived in a setting that was already hostile to them, full of racial prejudice against them, full of xenophobia, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the easy things to do in the 1870s or the 1880s when talking about America's opium problem was to say, oh, it's the Chinese that brought opium here. Like, oh, it's kind of their fault. And so they really got scapegoated for the phenomenon. The reality is that the vast majority of people in the US who used opium were not Chinese immigrant opium smokers. Also, the two populations tended to use opium differently. In Chinese communities, opium was used as a kind of recreational drug in the same way that other Americans would use whiskey or beer kind of as a social lubricant. And that's, opium is, I don't want to get too sciencey, but like the way that opium is consumed affects how it's, kind of heavy the effect on the system is. And so opium smoking is actually not a super efficient way of consuming opium. And so even when we kind of think about like the style of use, people who are using morphine, who are injecting morphine, who are Civil War veterans, are, it depends on the individual, the tolerance, there's a million different variables, but they're consuming some really heavy substances. Whereas Chinese immigrants who are smoking opium might not be as intoxicated as long, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that makes it even more ironic that the whole opium problem gets pinned on the other. Unfortunately, I think that is yet again another kind of parallel between the past and the present. It's really easy for folks who are already opposed for different reasons to immigration and to immigrants to say that they cause a drug problem when the historical reality is very, very different.
Mm. When you've spoken with audiences about this book, are there any things that they have misunderstandings about that they come in with that you like to dispel when they're asking Q&A and doing that kind of thing? Or is there something that you enjoy, pressing home that about this issue?
Yeah, I think that, and I also think this is changing more and more, right? The project, I kind of lived with this project for almost 10 years. And so I've seen a kind of shift in how people talk about addiction, even in that relatively short amount of time. When I first started doing this research, I was really moved by how a lot of the times, people that I would talk with about the research kind of came to the equation thinking that all drug users are just bad people, and that's why they use drugs. Of course, that's not even remotely true, right? That's just a kind of stereotype. But I find that that's kind of changing. Like, I find that the more that I talk to people, there's a better understanding that you can get addicted to any kind of substance for any reason. Like, there's a lot of different kind of variables and phenomenon involved. And so I think that kind of the humanity of the people that I studied, the 200 people that I wrote about, I always try to press home that they are just like us. In the past, like in the early days of the research, that was kind of a hard connection to make. More and more I find, though, that people have more sympathy than they used to, kind of as we're living with the opioid crisis. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. So what are you working on now, Jonathan, post Opium Slavery book, and what's a project that you are considering in the future?
I'm glad you asked. Gosh, where to begin? So I'm working on a new book project. It's actually a co-edited book with a couple of other historians called Megan Bever and Joseph Balin. And this book, it's called The Substances of War. And it takes not just opium, but also all of the, kind of substances that are used during the Civil War, like tobacco and quinine and snuff and booze, of course. How could we not include booze? And it's a book about how the Civil War was awash with these substances. And so it kind of takes the story that I tell in my book on opium, that my colleagues Megan and Joe tell in their books, which deal with alcohol and other phenomenon, and kind of zooms out and looks for sort of the bigger picture. And what we ultimately found, basically, is that 19th century society is, very, very kind of awash with these substances. We can't think about the Civil War. We can't think about the 1800s without dealing with the reality that substance use is everywhere. So that's one project. I'm also working on a couple of side projects. I'm a kind of historian of all trades sometimes. And so I'm in the middle of making a podcast about the Vietnam War with a group of students. So that's been kind of a passion project of mine too. One of the things that, as I study the Vietnam War and the Civil War, I'm shocked by how similar they are. We, usually don't kind of compare these two conflicts, but the way that they affected people's lives was dramatically similar. And so again, kind of a passion project of mine. We call our podcast Madison at War, and we're just about to publish the first 2 episodes. So,
oh, that's great. That's great. Where can people find out more information on your work, Jonathan?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, jonathansjones.net, and find links to all of my projects, whether it's the book, the first book, the second book, or this podcast, and other kind of assorted products. And so I'm always happy to talk with people. I love to hear what people think about the book, whether it's good or bad, it's okay. I just want to know what you think of it. So always welcome to send me an email as well. And you can find my contact info on the website.
That's awesome. And everyone in the chat, sorry, the chat is not working right now. YouTube, I'm going to have to send them an angry email. The book is actually pinned in the chat, but if you can't access the chat, go to the description below here. on the video, and there's a link directly to UNC Press and to Opium Slavery. I have my handy dandy copy here, and I still have to put flags in it. I've made the pencil marks. Now I got to put flags all through it because I'm an active reader. But Jonathan, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it, and this has been fascinating.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always great to chat.
Thank you again, everyone. Please be well, take care of yourselves, and keep reading.